Week 10. I cannot believe we're already here in November, but of course, I'm so glad that folks are still taking their time to get their waiver claims in, trying to manage their rosters, hopefully making some strong pushes for the playoffs, which are coming here in the next 3 to 4 weeks. But before we dive into all of that, we've got some news. Lamarca, of course, here with me today in week 10 in order to answer some of your waiver wire questions. But before we got started, we got some breaking news because today is the trade deadline. Teams are trying to make some moves. We heard about Khalil Herbert going to the Bengals earlier this morning. And now, of course, the Commanders, they just traded for Marshon Lattimore. Of course, there's not a ton of fantasy implications for that. But Lamarca, first, how are you doing? But second, what is your knee-jerk reaction just to the general knowledge of having Washington make this pretty big move to a defense that we thought we wanted to pick on earlier in the season?
Yeah. Hey, Chris, how are you? I'm doing pretty well today. Love that it's the trade deadline. And, the NFL, you get less trades at the deadline than you do in some of the other, major American sports, but still some meaningful stuff. The Lions also picked up a pass rusher in Zadarius Smith earlier today. So I do think that the biggest one here is the Marshon Lattimore ad for the Commanders. And unfortunately, I think it's a negative move for fantasy purposes, right? You mentioned that this is a team that has played in a lot of high scoring games all year. If their defense improves slightly, perhaps they don't have to do as much offensively to win games this season. So it's like the slightest of downgrades, but I think, you move Jaden Daniels down just a hair, you move Terry McLaurin down just a hair, and same thing probably goes for the Lions as well. Not that the Lions have been, especially on the passing side, a offensive juggernaut, but they're just going to continue to maul teams with their defense, control the clock on offense, and it could be a little bit rough for Jared Goff and Sam Laporta and Amon-Ra St. Brown, guys like that.
Yeah, I agree. And looking at the Commanders' upcoming schedule, so this week, I don't know if Lattimore is going to be active for this week, but for folks rostering George Pickens, they get the Steelers this weekend. So that might be a slight downgrade, assuming that Lattimore is able to go. But we'll see from a practice report standpoint if Lattimore is going to be active for this week. But then afterwards, let's assume A.J. Brown is going to be healthy because the Eagles face the Commanders in week 11. CeeDee Lamb and Cooper Rush, I'm assuming, are going to be playing against the Commanders in week 12 and then week 13. I don't know if you're starting Calvin Ridley at this point and you're still alive in your fantasy league. I'm sorry, but week 13, they do get to play against the Titans. So that is one of those more, I would say, we don't care as much about the defensive player movement from a fantasy football standpoint, but it is one of those things that, especially when a high caliber corner like Lattimore is on the move, I would pay attention to those types of moves than anything else. To your point, Lamarca, I mean, Zadarius Smith, like moving over to the Lions wouldn't be the first. I'm not changing my view of the Detroit Lions from a defensive standpoint. It's good that they get the help after Aiden Hutchinson went down a few weeks ago, but we've seen teams be able to move the ball at least somewhat against them over the past few weeks, like since Hutchinson went down. So I think it's more of a it's good for the team overall. But for Lattimore, I think that moves the needle just a bit more because of those game scripts that we were expecting between the Commanders and whatever offense that they were going to be playing against on a week-to-week basis. So with that being said, I'm sure there's going to be other news breaking throughout the next 45 to 50 minutes as we answer your questions. But of course, hop on into the chat. Let us know what you're thinking about week 10, trades, strategy questions, waiver wire questions. Like that is what Lamarca and I are here to do today. And if you don't get the chance to ask your questions live, go ahead and check out the waiver wire report that's available on FantasyLife.com, written by the wonderful Kendall Valenzuela. She does an excellent job putting together the hot options for each week. But let's go ahead and dive in. We do have a quick question, like already up in the chat right now, from Lex Plant Some Trees. Looks like this is more of a dynasty question than anything else, but we're happy to go ahead and take a look at it and see what analysis we can provide. So from Lex, Falcons D in a 2025 third for David Montgomery. Is that a collusion trade? We're trying to veto it. I don't know, man. That, to me, that does sound like a collusion trade, especially if it's a 1-6 team. He offered some context in the message right after that. To me, that sounds bad. 2025 third for David Montgomery. I would say on the one side, David Montgomery is an older running back, if memory serves. Like, how old is David Montgomery at this point? Like
Probably approaching 30.
Yeah, 27. So he's 27
Oh.
right now. Be 28 like before the start of the 2025 season. But getting up there in age for an RB, so I can understand that. But a 2025 third for a running back that's in the top 12 as of right now in terms of fantasy points per game, still on a tear from a touchdown perspective. I think he did wind up breaking his streak of like getting touchdowns. He didn't get one just this past week against the Packers. But looking at the Lions' upcoming schedule, Houston, Jacksonville, Indianapolis, still two of those three, I'd say, are prime matchups from a defensive standpoint. And we know that Detroit can be a buzzsaw. So I think it is a bit more weighted towards the person getting Montgomery than the person giving up Falcons defense, which I do not care about one iota. And the 2025 third, but where are you at with that one?
Yeah, I don't like to throw around the collusion word. The owners in the league obviously better than we do. It definitely doesn't look particularly fair, in my opinion. I understand if you have a team that is not contending and you want to cash in on David Montgomery while you can, but I think you could probably do a little bit better than a third round pick. So, and certainly like the defense part of this is just,
that's the part that smells the funny.
They could just be on the waiver wire for all I care. Like, it's a defense.
Yeah. I would say even if it was the Broncos defense that had been playing well, or what's another unit that's been fairly decent? Chargers has been okay. Detroit Lions, like they've been the ones that have been scoring from a defense and special team standpoint over the past few games. If it was the defense that was more of a high end, high scoring, getting sacks, pressures, and all of that, maybe I could see that, but defense seems like it is so volatile from a week to week and even season to season standpoint. Throwing them into that particular deal doesn't make a ton of sense to me. So I'm off that. I would say look a bit more into that one and see if you can have them send a bit more reasonable of an offer. All right, so let's move on to a few more questions. And of course, as folks start to file into the chat, I'm Chris Allen. That's Matt LaMarca. We are here to answer your Week 10 waiver wire questions. And of course, we appreciate you all joining us this week, as we've got plenty of stuff to get to, especially with the trade deadline upon us coming up this afternoon. But let's see what else is going on as of right now. All right, so from our own Nando DeFino, what's going on, brother? How do you rank the non-Thielen Panthers wide receivers for rest of season production? Of course, we just watched last week, Bryce Young still under center for Carolina. Quentin Johnston shipped off to the Ravens. We see Xavier Legette. We see not Jonathan Mingo isn't even there anymore. He also got traded earlier today over to the Dallas Cowboys. So really it is the Legette and Jalen Coker show, and Javian Sanders from a tight end perspective. But out of the non-Thielen pass catchers, LaMarca, where are you at? And are any of those guys on your radar for guys that we should be adding for Week 10 and beyond?
Yeah, I think Xavier Legette is clearly in that wide receiver 3 territory now. I mean, he still has to catch passes from Bryce Young, which is not the most inspiring quarterback in the league, but the utilization has been pretty good. He was on the field for 93% of the routes last week, 25% target share. He's had double-digit fantasy points now in 3 of his past 4 games. So I think he's the pretty clear number one. He's the guy that the team has invested real draft capital into. So he is the guy that I think they are going to push for that top job. I would have Jalen Coker as number 2, a rookie undrafted free agent that has steadily seen his role grow and has kind of been, making noise throughout the season. And I think you could do worse than roster David Moore at this point, to be 100% honest. Like, are you ever going to feel comfortable starting David Moore? No. But if you're a team that's absolutely desperate for wide receiver production, I mean, he's been on the field a lot the last 2 weeks. He's had a 15% target share or more in back-to-back games. And now there's going to be more opportunities potentially without Mingo moving forward. So I think all 3 of those guys, if you're in a deep league, deserve to be owned. But for me, it's pretty clearly Legette 1, Coker 2, and then David Moore 3.
I agree with that. And I pulled up our utilization report, the game logs that's available on fantasylife.com with a tier 2 subscription. If you want to go ahead and check that out, I think it's around $8 to $9 a month in order to get access to these tools. Powered by Dwayne McFarland's brain, the man with the wonderful hair here at fantasylife.com.
Best hair.
He has the best hair.
It's a good head of lettuce, man.
Ain't no doubt about it. I mean, you came in looking pretty sharp today, Lamarco. I ain't gonna lie to you, man. But I would say out of the group, we have to give that award to Dwayne. I'm sorry, man. I have to do it.
I'm not even trying to get into that conversation. So.
But to your point, though, looking at Xavier Legette and his usage so far, even when Deontay Johnson was still a part of the roster, we started to see his targets and air yards to creep up. But then in weeks 7, 8, and 9, we saw him crest the 15% target share, over 20% of the targets over the past couple of weeks. Now, he did have this past week that ridiculous catch, but the ball got ripped away, turned into an interception. He was even talking about it after the game, about how bad that was a play for him. He didn't understand how that happened, but still, he is the guy that is being used both on the perimeter and the interior, having the high air yard shares, as you can see from the fourth or fifth column over here. So between him, Jalen Coker, those are probably the two that I would want to trust the most. I know some of the coke heads out there, I guess that was the nickname I saw being tossed around over the weekend, which is kind of odd. But for the coke heads out there, I do see some concern with Adam Thielen coming back this week, because he has been the team's primary slot man. Bryce Young was using him quite a bit throughout the 2023 season. So I would say that between Legette, and we'll see what Thielen looks like in his return, Legette the one, and we'll see how things shake out between Thielen and Jalen Coker. All right. So quick question to you, Lamarca. Out of some of the players that are getting picked up this week, some of the hot options, who are the guys that are on your radar the most? The guy that you are probably going to have as your number one claim for week 10.
Yeah. So I don't think it's a great waiver week, to be 100% honest. There aren't guys that jump off the page the same way we had last week. We had Cedric Tillman, I thought was a great rest of season pickup. Leagues where Tyrone Tracy was available, amazing rest of season pickup. And then even, there were still leagues where Cade Otton wasn't owned at tight end, and arguably he's the number one tight end in fantasy at the moment. Mm-hmm. I don't see a guy like that necessarily available in most leagues this week. The guy that stands out to me the most is Jauan Jennings. I think with the 49ers coming out of a bye, there's a chance that Jennings was dropped if the owner who had him needed a bench spot for the week. And he should walk into a pretty consistent wide receiver 2 role for the 49ers. Mm-hmm. How many targets that's going to get on a weekly basis, that remains to be seen, especially if Christian McCaffrey is able to return this week. And he did, return to practice, or is expected to return to practice this week. But I do think that Jennings is sort of the most consistent guy in terms of opportunities and ability and supporting cast out of all the players who are, widely available in leagues this week.
That's an interesting one. I hadn't considered Jennings because of the lack of usage as they were heading into their bye week. Also had the injury, and not really seeing how he's going to, not necessarily seeing how he's going to fit into the offense, but what is that usage going to look like with Christian McCaffrey expected to be available this upcoming week after the Achilles tendonitis that's kept him sidelined for the last 2.5 months or so. That's an interesting one because after week 3 explosion, over 40 PPR points, the man looked like the second coming of Jerry Rice out there. I wonder how much that was just we're going to anchor our expectations for Jennings based off of that singular game. Now, for a couple of games afterwards, again, I'll go ahead and pull up the utilization report game logs just so we can have a better context for for our expectations for Jauan Jennings. So week 3, 40% target share, in week 3 for Jennings. And that's when he went off again for over 40 PPR points. After that, 23%, 13%, popped up for the 19% target share there afterwards. And of course, the injury that knocked him out shortly thereafter. So I do have some general concerns about what his usage is going to look like. But even if he's sitting around the 15 to 20% target share on an offense that we know to be one of the more efficient offenses in the league. From a yards per game standpoint, I believe it's just the 49ers and Ravens that have been getting over like 30 points per game from a scoring standpoint. I would say that we would want to have a guy like Jennings, at least on our roster. Let's look at what week 10 looks like with CMC back in the fold. But of course, with Brandon Ayuk done for the season, Deebo Samuel in and out of the lineup so far over the last month with him being sick, also battling an injury earlier part of the season, Jennings should have a decent role. It's just understanding how much of that pie in San Francisco he's going to earn. So I completely understand. That's a good call out, Lamar.
One of the metrics that I really like when you're talking about a bit player or a part-time player who's moving into a more prominent role is targets per route run. I feel like that shows your ability whenever you're on the field to get open, right? Mm-hmm. You only really earn targets when you're open. And in 3 of Jennings' 6 games this season, he's been targeted on at least 29% of his routes run. So I think he's a decent player, and I think his routes should eclipse 80% now that we're talking no Brandon Ayuk at receiver for the 49ers. So I'm a little bit more bullish on him, I think, than you are, but I think, in a good offense with an expanded role, he's somebody that I would feel pretty comfortable starting as like a wide receiver 3 most weeks.
I agree. So maybe tacking him on the back end, because some folks like myself might have that bad taste in their mouth over the last few weeks of not being able to use Jennings. So maybe you can slide him in as a guy you just pick up off the waiver wire and put him on your bench. Not a bad idea, especially given the number of injuries you had. AJ Brown being knocked out, DK Metcalf not also being injured, now on bye for week 10. There are some guys that we've had to work around from a fantasy football standpoint. So adding a guy like Jennings might be the best way to go about it. All right. So let's see. We've got a few more questions in the chat. And again, appreciate everybody for stopping by here for week 10. It looks like we've got one from Tyler Sperry. Let's see if we can answer his question. So who is the better pickup, Legette or Quentin Johnston? Sorry for the spelling. I don't know if I should keep Coleman as well. And Keon Coleman, I believe he was injured just this past week, either wrist forearm injury, something along those lines, if memory serves. But luckily for you, Terry, it looks like I would say our own Kendall Valenzuela does agree with you from a waiver wire standpoint, because if you check out her waiver wire article that's up for this week, coming into this week, Quentin Johnston is like one of the top ads that she has for week 10. Looking at his usage over the past few weeks, it does look like he is the guy that I would target. But for either of those two guys, I mean, Legette or Quentin Johnston, QJ, like Lamarca, how are you leaning?
I prefer Legette. I think the role is going to be a lot more consistent with him. Johnston, he did go off for a big game this week. He had a solid showing in week 2 as well, but he is very much a boomer bust kind of guy in a inconsistent passing attack. He's going to need to score touchdowns, right? I do not think that Johnston is a guy who is going to get, to 7 or 8 targets on a pretty regular basis. For the year, he's at a 19% target share. He's been at 19% or lower in 4 straight games. Ladd McConkey, I think, is pretty clearly the number 1 guy in that Chargers passing attack. So I'm not rushing out to add Quentin Johnston this week. I think that what you saw in week 9 was very much the outlier performance for him. And I am not expecting that type of consistency from him moving forward. I think Legette is a much stronger bet, even with a worse quarterback, to get to that, 7+ target threshold most weeks. So I think he's the guy that I prefer. Certainly, like, the Chargers passing attack has taken some steps forward in recent weeks, but QJ just still is a guy that I don't know if I'm ever going to feel comfortable starting him. So I'm not rushing out to add him off the wire.
I could agree with that. And Friedman and I on the Sunday show, we've had this bit going pretty much the entire season of who inspires the most joy. And Quentin Johnston, I think I guess the reaction that we had to his rookie season of the drops not being able to work into the offense, all of that still kind of lingers. And even though he's had I'd say a pretty positive sophomore season, I still go back to what he looked like as a rookie. I'm still holding that against him, which I know is wrong. Not a good process. We have more data to support that he's in a better situation. He's a better player. But to your point, he's averaging 3 targets in week 6, 5 targets in week 9. Not a ton of volume that we can really rely on from a fantasy production standpoint. So I'm with you. I see Legette as the better talent, also getting a bit more volume in his offense, even though piloted by a worse quarterback. I would lean a bit more towards Legette. But if you can stash QJ, see if that offense continues to move as it has, positive passer over expectation for the 3 weeks heading into just this past week. So if the volume continues to be there, I'd say stashing QJ, not a bad idea. But if I had to choose between the two, it would be Legette. All right, so let's keep it moving. Who's up next? I believe it's one from Germs, the Germ. Taysom's package going to get huge now with no Olave. This Taysom package, this is Denny Carter, man. I swear he's the one that came up with this. I shake my fist at you, Denny. But I do agree with this because Hill's usage, not just as a passer, a receiver, a rusher. In his first game back in week 9, he was used pretty much as all three positions on the field. So for you, LaMarca, even without Olave, no Rashid Shaheed, didn't see much at no Bub Means. They are down to essentially Alvin Kamara and everybody else. And it's pretty much just Taysom Hill. I'm with you. At least I'm of the mindset that if you have Hill, you're starting him.
Yeah, I think he's pretty clearly in the tight end 1 territory now, more towards the back half of it than the top half. But yeah, you can do a lot worse than Taysom Hill at tight end. You mentioned the opportunities for him. Like, there's a legit chance that I start at receiver for the Saints this week. That's how bad things have gotten there. I think Chris Olave almost certainly is out for a while. Second concussion this season. Last week's was pretty scary. It wouldn't shock me if that's a multi-week absence. So what else do the Saints have, right? I mean, even Alvin Kamara, as good as he is, I don't think he's a guy that you necessarily want to give 25 carries in a game. He's always been at his best when he's been, like 15 carries and 8 targets. Like that's his ideal usage. So I could see a lot of Taysom Hill. I could even see, some of the other running backs maybe getting into the picture in New Orleans, but Taysom Hill, with his sort of jack of all trades skill set, I think, yeah, he's, somewhere around like tight end 6 to 8 for me, I would say, going forward.
Somewhere in there makes sense, and it's more of the red zone usage for me than anything else.
Yep.
We don't typically see, he might get a deep shot here and there down the sidelines in order to create an explosive, but it's just once they get inside the 20, inside the 10, you'll see Derek Carr get swapped out. Taysom Hill comes in, takes a carry. He winds up getting into the end zone. So I do have some concerns, and I see Tyler Sperry's comment in the chat about we don't know how that offense may or may not run since they did fire Dennis Allen, even though Dennis Allen more of a defensive-minded head coach than anything else. We'll see if they try and shake things up. But I would say that since they do have so few options available to them at this point, because of the injuries, because of the guys they've put on injured reserve, because of the offensive line considerations as well, they've had a number of shakeups along the O-line throughout the last like 3 to 4 weeks with injuries and things of that nature. I would say Hill is probably their second best weapon without Olave, Alvin Kamara, and then give me the case for somebody else. Is Juwan Johnson really going to be the guy that they're going to turn to? I don't see that happening. So I think at least from a usage standpoint, Hill probably grades out as one of the better tight ends, or I don't know if he's still quarterback eligible on some platforms, but either way, I would say Hill has to be in at least the tight end 1 conversation moving forward, given how few options the New Orleans Saints have at their disposal at this point.
Taysom Hill is like Thanos and cockroaches. It's not going anywhere.
Inevitable,
right?
Man.
It is inevitable.
Just inevitable. All right. I see some news in the chat, and I had to go and double check and make sure, but we have more breaking news, LaMarca. Mike Williams traded from the Jets over to the Steelers. What more did they need? Of course, you have George Pickens as the wide receiver one, moving over, also primarily being used as a perimeter receiver. They've been working in Van Jefferson. We've seen Calvin Austin getting worked in as well. So of course they needed to add another downfield threat for this Russell Wilson led offense. So I don't hate it at first sight for the Steelers offense as a whole, because we already know where the fantasy points are going to be scored from the Jets perspective. But what's your knee-jerk reaction to this breaking news? Again, on trade deadline Tuesday.
Perfect fit, I think. We know Russell Wilson. He likes to take those shots down the field. This gives him another guy like George Pickens who is capable of winning those one-on-one matchups. It's just a good fit for what they want to do. I think Van Jefferson, just meh as a football player, and this allows Calvin Austin to handle sort of the short part of the field. You get Pickens and Williams on the outside. I have been bullish on this Steelers team all season. I'm kind of I'm a little bit more of a betting guy than a fantasy guy at this point, but I like what the Steelers are doing. I really think that, they're kind of assembling like the meme team, right? You bring in Russell Wilson, you bring in Arthur Smith, but it's just all kind of working for them. And with their defense, I think they're going to be a good unit moving forward. So Mike Williams, back on the fantasy radar, in my opinion.
I agree. I think having him as the wide receiver 3-ish on an offense that once Russell Wilson came back as the starter, we knew that they were going to use more play action shot plays to the perimeter, because that's how Russ Wilson likes to play. And of course, play action is a heavy staple of Arthur Smith-led offenses. We saw that when he was down in Atlanta, of course, when he was also back in Tennessee, and the offense was a bit more efficient. Now, I can't say for certain that's always going to be the case, because teams may see that as a tendency for them, try and key in on it. And will those volatile passes of 15 or 20 air yards, will the receivers always be able to come down with them? Who's to say? But if Mike Williams is going to work in as that receiver that's going to get some of those catches, then that production might be there for him, at least more so than what he was getting from Aaron Rodgers in New York. So I think maybe tacking him, grabbing him off the waiver wire, tacking him onto the end of your bench, seeing how that works out. Because looking at Pittsburgh's schedule at Washington, we just talked about that with the Commanders making the move for Marshawn Lattimore. Baltimore in week 11, we know their secondary can get beat. Cleveland in week 12, and then Cincinnati in week 13 for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I would say 2 out of maybe 3 out of the 4 matchups are either neutral to positive for Mike Williams. So not a bad ad for fantasy managers looking to see if they can get something out of the Pittsburgh passing game other than just George Pickens. Okay, let's keep it moving. Like to seeing some more, so many more questions here in the chat, but let's keep things moving right along. Got about another 20, 30 minutes to go to answer some of your questions for week 10. From Irish Heart, should I drop Bo Nix and pick up Justin Herbert? I don't know if the PPR scoring changes things for you for quarterback scoring, but either way, who are you with, Bo Nix or Justin Herbert?
I have them pretty close rest of season rankings, but I would make the switch just because of this week, right? You've got Bo Nix going into Kansas City, really tough matchup. They're significant underdogs in that game. Meanwhile, Justin Herbert has a matchup with the Titans, I believe. So much more favorable spot for Herbert than for Nix this specific week. So I would make the move just based on that. Do I think it's a league-changing type of move? No, I think ultimately their fantasy production is going to be pretty close from here on out, but I give Herbert the slight edge this week.
I can agree with that. I would say so I have the quarterback versus defense. So we do have a DVP tool available over on FantasyLife.com. And to your point with the Chargers going up against Tennessee this week, Tennessee to quarterbacks is about 23rd, and Kansas City actually they're about equal. But we did just see the Chiefs, I'd say, limit to some degree what the passing production was going to be for Baker Mayfield last week. He was couple of passes away from throwing a couple of interceptions. I know the rain towards the back end of that game did affect things to some degree, but I do have some concerns about what the Chiefs are going to be able to affect or do against Knicks and the Broncos offensive line. So I'm with you. Herbert slightly grades out as the better option. We do know for certain that Herbert is the better passer of the football compared to Bo Nix at the stages of each's career so far. So I'm with you. I think Herbert for this week for sure. Let's see how things shake out for the rest of the season, given the fact that we've seen Nix as the better rusher and actually the rushing production being able to provide a floor for Bo Nix. Okay, let's keep things moving right along. Let's see, who do we got? Stafford or Purdy rest of season? I think right now my knee-jerk reaction would be give me Matthew Stafford, especially after the game that they just played this past week. I know most of their win goes to Geno Smith and the turnovers that he had, but Stafford with Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, assuming Puka Nacua doesn't throw a punch during the game and get ejected, but if he has both of those guys available to him, Matthew Stafford in this Rams offense continues to get done on a week in, week out basis. I lean Stafford, but do you think Purdy has the better case, or where are you at?
Very, very close. I think you can pretty much just flip a coin here. I'm going to go with Brock Purdy. I think Christian McCaffrey coming back. We've seen this offense just be super explosive in the past. I mean, they were basically a lock for 30 points per game last week when they were fully healthy last year, excuse me. So I'd give Purdy just the slightest of edges, but I think both guys are very startable at this point.
Mm-hmm. My concern for Purdy, and then you probably didn't have this context in front of you. Let's look at their schedules coming up. So coming out of their bye, they get to face the Buccaneers. We just saw Patrick Mahomes have a decent day. Multiple passers have gone for over 200 yards and multiple touchdowns against the Buccaneers secondary over the past 3 to 4 weeks. Afterwards, Seattle, we know their defense can be beat. Packers is a tough out. Bills are a tough out. Chicago in week 14. I think that's about the first week of the fantasy playoffs. Also a tough out. Looking at the Rams' upcoming schedule, Miami, New England, Philly, New Orleans without Marshawn Lattimore, and then Buffalo in week 14. So I don't know. Looking at their schedules, I think the Rams have a better short-term schedule, but of course, having Buffalo in week 14 is also not that easy for them. So short-term, I'll give the edge to Stafford, but I completely understand given how efficient the 49ers offense has still been, even without Brandon Ayuk, without George Kittle being in and out of the lineup, with having so many guys injured or sick. The 49ers have still been able to get it done. So I definitely understand having Brock Purdy as the better of the two. But I would say I don't know, give it up to I'd say you can't go wrong in this particular one, since we're on. We need a third person here in order to break the tie. That's what we need right now. That's the problem with having just two hosts here. We can't break the tie.
Well,
So
I'll say that you did a good job making the case for Stafford on a schedule standpoint. So I'll change my vote, and Stafford can.
There we go. All right. I was able to convince us. Now we're 2 for Matthew Stafford. So we can actually give you a complete answer, Jerry. You got Stafford for the rest of the season over Brock Purdy. Okay, so keeping things moving right along, we got about another 20-ish minutes or so, seeing some more questions in there. So if you have questions about waivers for week 10, strategy questions, trade questions, anything you've got in order to position your roster so that you can get into the playoffs for the 2024 season, that's what Lamarca and I are here to do today. So what do we got next? What other questions do folks have? Let's go ahead and pop another one up there. Hey, guys, what's going on, Abiel? 2-quarterback league, and I'm currently starting Derek Carr. I'm sorry. Would you trade Dobbins for Mahomes? I have solid RB depth. He would also be willing to take Chase Brown or Jaden Reed. All right. Trading for Patrick Mahomes, I can understand that. He has been playing a little bit better. It definitely should be better than Derek Carr. Would you, I guess I'll ask this in 2 parts. First part, would you do the first deal about Dobbins for Mahomes? And we'll stop there.
Yes. If I had good depth and needed a quarterback, I would certainly feel comfortable enough moving on from J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins been a fine fantasy asset this year, especially considering what you paid for him. But the efficiency has really kind of crept down as the season has progressed. I don't think he is an RB1 or anything like that. And the upgrade from Mahomes or to Mahomes from Carr feels significant. So I would make that move. And, to move on to part two, I would feel much more comfortable trading Dobbins than I would either Chase Brown or Jaden Reed.
Yeah, and one of the ways that you can figure out running back value, not relative to quarterbacks, so you can maybe adjust this deal, but one thing that is available on FantasyLife.com, the utilization report score that's available, you should be able to take a look at each player, look at where they stack up relative to other running backs in the league and figure out how much value that they really have. And for Dobbins so far, and to your point, Lamarca, the explosive plays that we saw for the first 3 weeks, haven't seen as much of that over the past 2 to 3 weeks, but still from a usage standpoint, it's not like we've seen more from Kamani Vidal. Gus Edwards still on IR, hasn't been back in the lineup for some time now. From a usage standpoint, Dobbins grades out as one of the higher end running backs in the league. Chuba, you can see from a UR score standpoint, he sits around Chuba Hubbard, Ramondre Stevenson, DeAndre Swift, Josh Jacobs, the workhorse type running backs. So at least for me, if I would be trading away a guy like J.K. Dobbins and getting Patrick Mahomes, I would maybe ask for a little bit more. But Patrick Mahomes hasn't been a top 12 quarterback. So doing going from trading away J.K. Dobbins and getting Patrick Mahomes, yes, a significant upgrade at the quarterback position. But if you're not really getting a high-end quarterback one, if we're not talking about, I wouldn't even necessarily say a Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, those types of guys, but even players that can pop off for high touchdown games in the Joe Burrow type, or even Brock Purdy, in that type of tier. So I would say if you could ask for a little bit more, maybe a wide receiver a wide receiver 2, bench wide receiver, just to get a bit more back in the deal, that would be my suggestion versus doing it completely straight up. But at the very least, I do agree, Lamar. I would do that first part of that deal, at least get an upgrade at quarterback. The second part, I don't think I'd trade away Chase Brown. We'll talk a bit more about Khalil Herbert. I did see a question about that in the chat, but Chase Brown, Jaden Reed, those are focal points of their respective offenses. And those are definitely guys that I would want a bit more back for than just getting Patrick Mahomes in that deal.
Yeah, and I do think it's important to look at the Mahomes stuff with context. Obviously, it's been a really awful start for him, by his standards. But I think now that you have DeAndre Hopkins getting integrated more fully into the team's passing attack, it should shock no one if he starts to perform like a QB1 over the final stretch of the season, right? He's been missing that guy really since Rashee Rice went down with an injury. And, yes, he still has Travis Kelce, but this gives him a legitimate wide receiver that he can lean on now. So I think that Mahomes is poised for a little bit of improvement moving forward. And, as much as Dobbins has been great and has had that consistent usage, running backs pop up from time to time, right? Chase Brown, somebody that would not have been in the running back 2 consideration a few weeks ago, now is somebody that I would have ranked ahead of J.K. Dobbins. So if you're active on the wire, I think you can find running backs. I do not think you can find quarterbacks, especially quarterbacks the caliber of Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah, I think I could agree with that. Yeah. All right. Let's keep things moving right along. Let's see. What's the next question we've got here? Ooh, this is a deep one.
Ooh, baby.
12-team, non-PPR, 3 wide receivers, Brian Robinson, Ramondre Stevenson, Deontay Johnson for Puka and Terry. He's desperate for a running back. Running backs are Jacob, Charbonnet, Spears, and Gibson. Wide receivers are Justin Jefferson, Puka, Terry, QJ, Lockett, Wandale, and Gabe Davis. So Brian Robinson, Ramondre Stevenson, Deontay Johnson for Puka and Terry. I'm going to take a second to think about this one. But my first inclination would be I wouldn't want to do that deal. That's my first thought, but I'm trying to figure out why I wouldn't want to do that deal. But Lamarca, where are you at on this?
So my gut feeling, and this is just kind of a blanket statement for fantasy, is I never want to be the team that's giving up 2 players and getting back 3 players, because inherently that means I'm giving up the better players. So I completely understand wanting to trade away some of your depth at receiver and improve another position. I would maybe try to isolate one of those running backs and see if you can get it on more of like a straight up type deal. Can you get Brian Robinson straight up for Terry McLaurin? Something like that.
Mhm.
That would be a deal that I would be more interested in doing. You know, unfortunately with this trade, I think you're giving up two of the, maybe even the two best players in this deal. So that to me is the type of trade that I try to avoid for fantasy purposes. I never want to be the guy who's giving up the best player unless I absolutely have to.
Maybe if there was a different wide receiver, Deontay Johnson played maybe 10 snaps just this past week. Zay Flowers has been a bona fide wide receiver one, just not a
Yep.
not just as a wide receiver one, getting the most volume on his team, but being used at multiple depths of the field. Lamar Jackson still has either himself or Derrick Henry to hand the ball off once again into the red zone. So I'm not seeing the return in value at the wide receiver position in getting back Deontay Johnson. So maybe it was a different wide receiver, I might have a bit more confidence in making this deal. But I'm with you, trying to split that up. So maybe Terry McLaurin for Brian Robinson, even though it's funny that they're on the same team, but like Terry McLaurin and Brian Robinson plus a wide receiver, or Puka for Ramondre plus a wide receiver. I think that's where I would probably try and make sure that you're getting something equitable and useful back in the trade. Because if you're essentially relying on Justin Jefferson and maybe QJ, Lockett and Wandale, I mean, the rest of your wide receivers, you're basically playing stars and scrubs afterwards, because it's Justin Jefferson and then everybody else afterwards. So I would want at least a wide receiver two to help hold me over on some of those weeks where you might not get over 100 yards from Justin Jefferson in a single week, which is, I mean, you can probably count on that on a week-to-week basis given how he plays, but still, I would want a bit more back in those trades. All right, we got about maybe less than 10 minutes left. Let's see if we can rapid fire through some of these and get through as many questions as possible with the remaining time. So let's see, from All in One Show, 5-4 off a 5-game win streak. Can I go for Puka? What other trades can I do need to ride this streak? I think you can go for Puka. Any wide receiver should be up for debate, or at least up for negotiations at this point. Depending on who's on your roster, I would definitely try and trade for Puka Nacua. The injury doesn't seem to be as much of a concern. I know that, what was it, Friday he popped up on the injury report. Still did not look like the injury was affecting him when he was in the game. Of course, getting ejected didn't help from an evaluation standpoint. But I would say if you can go after Puka, I would definitely do that.
Sure. Yeah. And I think if you are, 5-4, I would not say is like, I'm comfortably in the playoff position, but like, let's say you're 8-1, 7-2, and you feel like you've got the playoffs pretty much in sight. I think you want to be exploring trades for guys who are hurt, but will be back, like DK Metcalf. One example, like, if DK Metcalf misses another game and the guy who has Metcalf is fighting for wins, and you have a roster that is already geared for the playoffs and a record that is ready for the playoffs, like, those are the trades that I like to try and make, where I am, paying 75 cents on the dollar for a guy who's a fantasy stud, but the opposing manager needs production in the lineup right now. So if you're feeling comfortable about where your roster is at the moment, those are the trades that you should be exploring.
Okay. And I see in his separate message, he has Burrow, Jahmyr Gibbs, DeAndre Swift, Zay Flowers, Drake London. This is a pretty solid lineup so far from what I'm seeing on the bench. He's got Jacobs, Kelsey, McMillan, and Pollard. I think from a usage standpoint, or from like who you have on your roster, maybe trying to trade away Higgins on the upside. So Higgins plus a running back. So maybe Higgins plus Jacobs to go and get Puka Nacua, something along those lines. That might at least entice negotiations. I would try something from there, because Zay Flowers, I think, should steadfastly be involved, like in the wide receiver one conversation for the rest of the season. Drake London, with suffering the injury just this past week, and we'll see what his availability for week 10 is going to be, might not at least have this. Fantasy managers might not have the same appetite for a guy like London, whereas we've seen the high points with Higgins, and it's really just been a health concern. So maybe that type of deal where it's a guy that has been injured plus somebody else on your roster, that might be a way to get things started and go after a guy like Puka Nacua, who's also been injured and also has injury concerns as well. So that might be a way to get things started.
Yeah, and another type of move that I think if you have a good team, consolidate your depth and upgrade.
Yeah.
That's the counterpoint of the I don't like being the team giving up the 2 and getting the 3. I
Mhm.
love being the team that's giving up the 2 and getting the 1 because I
Agree.
am undoubtedly getting the best player in that trade.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So we got about 5, 6, 7 minutes left, somewhere around there. Let's see how many more questions we can get to before we get out for today. So this one from Sylvester. Hello, fellows. Would you drop Michael Pittman for someone like Quentin Johnston or maybe even Khalil Herbert? Yes, emphatically, yes. Drop Michael Pittman. Absolutely. In the 3 to 4 games with Josh Downs coming back into the offense, Downs had the same or higher target share. We haven't seen Pittman really eclipse like the 100-yard mark at any point this season. We thought Joe Flacco being back in the offense was going to be a plus for that. We saw that fail spectacularly in prime time on Sunday. I'm out on Michael Pittman. Where are you at?
I'm giving Pittman another week. I still think his upside is higher than QJ and definitely Khalil Herbert. I want one more week where we see it from Flacco, and then I'll reevaluate. He still had a 16% target share last week. That's basically the same mark that Quentin Johnston has had for most of the year. It was just a bad game. Nobody really got going in that Colts game, and the Vikings have a tough defense. So I'd run it back one more week, and if he, has another subpar performance, then I probably would consider moving on.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Fair enough. Tough matchup for the Colts again this week, going up against the Bills and then the Jets after that. But either way, give it one more week. Let's see where we're at. If there are other guys that had sparked a bit more interest from a usage standpoint, I can understand that. But I think you do make a good point, Lamarca. It's not like we're going to get a ton more production out of Quentin Johnston. So at least seeing what's available in Michael Pittman, a guy we know to have been productive in the past. All right, man. I'll give it one more. I'll give it one more week. All right, let's keep things rolling. What else we got going on in the chat as of right now? Trade Tolbert and Zay Flowers for Jake Ferguson and George Pickens PPR. I want to keep Zay Flowers. I want the better player in the deal. I think Flowers is head and shoulders above George Pickens so far this season. I would rather keep those two. It sounds like you agree with me, though.
Completely. I mean, I don't think I like Jake Ferguson. I think Jake Ferguson is a good tight end. He's now going to be catching passes from Cooper Rush for the foreseeable future. That downgrades him in my eyes. I don't think that's a big enough upgrade compared to whoever your tight end is to downgrade from Flowers to Pickens. And, Tolbert is essentially nothing to me at this point.
That's exactly where I'm at. We saw like Cooper Rush, he did play decent, although it was in essentially garbage time for the Cowboys this past week, was able to connect with both CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson on multiple targets in that last few, like 5, 6, 7 minutes for the Cowboys. But still, we know it's going to be a downgrade for the Cowboys offense as a whole. We don't even know what to expect from a play calling standpoint for Rush moving forward. So if I can keep Zay Flowers, who's attached to a much better offense in the Baltimore Ravens, I would rather do that. And of course, the Ravens played the Cincinnati Bengals, who we just watched have Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers hit for multiple explosive gains. So their defense is still a problem. I would keep Zay Flowers. All right, one more question before we get on out of here. And if you do have any more questions, of course, go and check out the rankings that should be available up on the site as of tomorrow. Any of the like the content that we currently have up there, the waiver wire report, tools that are available, and hit us up on Twitter. More than happy to answer your questions, like even after the show is done. But let's see what we can answer for you here. Is Mike Williams or Lazard worth getting? I'd say Mike Williams is the better option. Most of the targets have been going to either Garrett Wilson or Devontae Adams. Even once Lazard comes back and has a larger part in that offense, I would prefer Mike Williams and the high-end upside that he presents versus trying to see what Allen Lazard could be in this Jets offense.
Agreed. I mean, Allen Lazard or Lizard, I think he is kind of in that Taysom Hill tier where it is kind of inevitable that he's going to continue to get work because Aaron Rodgers just loves that guy. But Williams clearly has the superior upside given his projected role with the Steelers moving forward.
Yeah, that's the easier call for me. I'll take the upside. Let's see if a wide receiver 2 emerges in Pittsburgh's offense. We know Russell Wilson likes to throw things downfield. That's where Williams likes to operate. And instead of trying to bank on the red zone targets that Lazard was getting on the earlier parts of the season, my assumption is that those are going to go to one of Garrett Wilson, he of the excellent catch, one-handed catch that we saw last week, or Devontae Adams. So with that, that is it for today. Of course, follow both of us on Twitter. Ask us any questions that we might have. Shoot us. My DMs are open. I don't know about you, LaMarco, but anybody has any questions, feel free. We'll definitely be taking more questions throughout the week. But that is all that we have for today. Thanks for everybody and all their participation throughout the chat. Good luck in week 10 for myself, for LaMarco.